What if one ordinary television segment could turn into a moment that silences an entire studio, moves a global celebrity to tears, and reaches across oceans to connect two souls who had never met? Today, you're about to witness that moment, one that started with a message but ended with a movement. This isn't a story about politics. It's a story about purpose, unexpected brotherhood, and the ripple effect of hope when a voice truly matters. Steve Harvey, a man known for his humor, charisma, and powerful storytelling, was hosting his talk show just like any other day. But as he shared a personal reflection on overcoming poverty, something unusual happened. A quiet interruption, a whisper from backstage, and then an unexpected message from the president of Burkina Faso. What followed was one of the most emotionally powerful exchanges ever seen on television. Not scripted, not staged, just one man's heartfelt words reaching another, and the result? Tears, silence, and the undeniable reminder that no act of kindness or authenticity ever goes unnoticed. But here's where it gets even deeper. That message didn't just stir Steve Harvey. It stirred the world. And it might stir something in you too. So before we dive into this incredible story of a talk show host, a president, a little girl with a letter, and a bond that defied borders, we want to know something about you. Which country are you watching from right now? What time is it where you are? Morning, late night, or somewhere in between? Drop your answers in the comments below. We truly want to hear from you. And while you're here, if this kind of story moves you, hit that subscribe button, turn on the notification bell, and stay with us. Because stories like this, they remind us that the world isn't as divided as it seems, and that sometimes a single sentence can change someone's life forever. Let's begin. It was a regular weekday morning. The lights of the studio glowed, the applause rang loud, and Steve Harvey walked onto the stage with his signature energy and infectious smile. For most viewers, it seemed like just another episode of his popular talk show, where laughter, life advice, and heartfelt stories blended together. The audience cheered, standing up to greet him as he launched into the day's topic: the power of purpose. It was a theme Steve was known for, something close to his heart. He had told this story before. Growing up poor in Cleveland, sleeping in a car, struggling through endless rejections before his big break. But this time, as he reached the emotional peak of his monologue, something unexpected happened. From the edge of the stage, a production assistant walked briskly toward him. She whispered something into his ear that made him pause, blink, and look off camera. Steve's expression shifted, first confusion, then disbelief. The room, once filled with warmth and applause, suddenly quieted. He cleared his throat and turned to address the audience. Folks, I've just been informed that there's a very special message I need to see, and it's coming from somewhere I never expected. A few chuckles scattered through the audience, unsure of what he meant. Then the studio screen behind him lit up, not with a sponsor, not with the next guest, but with a golden national seal. In bold letters it read, "A message from President Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso." The mood changed instantly. Steve, known for always having a comeback or a punchline ready, stood frozen. He stared at the screen, brow furrowed. "Wait, what? The president of Burkina Faso?" he asked softly, more to himself than to the audience. Why would he send me anything? For a moment, the show became something else. Not entertainment, but a window into something deeply personal and human. Steve sat down slowly, resting his hands on the arms of his chair, eyes locked on the screen. The camera zoomed in, the room went silent, and then the video began. The screen flickered to life with a calm, dignified setting. A modest wooden desk, a national flag behind it, and a man in a simple but elegant outfit. His eyes were steady. His voice, soft but resonant, spoke with warmth. "Mr. Steve Harvey," the man began, his English clear with a melodic West African accent. "I speak not just as a leader, but as a brother." Steve leaned forward, his posture tightening. The room collectively leaned in with him. "You don't know me," the president continued, "but we know you." In that moment, it became evident this wasn't a PR stunt. This was no political broadcast. It was personal. In the villages of Burkina Faso, President Traoré said, "Your voice has reached farther than you imagine. Your stories, your struggles, your belief in second chances, they echo through places you may never visit. But they are remembered." Steve's hands gripped the arms of the chair tighter. The emotions started to rise, subtle at first, but visible. He blinked slowly, processing each word. Then the president's voice began to tremble slightly. "During our darkest hours," he said, "when our people feared war, when hope seemed distant, it was your words that reminded me that true leadership is not about power, but about heart." The studio was now completely still. You could almost hear the breaths being held. The audience, production crew, and even the cameramen were captivated. Then, the line came that cracked the silence open like a shell. "From one boy who once had nothing in Africa, to one boy who once had nothing in America, I thank you." Steve's eyes welled. No words escaped his mouth, only a quiet gasp. He reached into his pocket for a tissue, nodding faintly. What could he say? How could he respond to a message like that? But the president wasn't done. He continued, "In my country, we call that kind of soul a heart of the sun. Warm, brave, and always giving light even when it burns itself out," Steve whispered, almost involuntarily. Wow. The sincerity in his voice resonated throughout the space. Then, with a pause and a softer tone, the president said, "This message is not political, it is personal. You reminded me a man once barefoot, sleeping hungry, that I must never give up on my people." The video faded momentarily. Steve turned toward his team, his voice shaky. What? What did he say just now?" A translator quickly stepped in, reading from a note card. He said, "Even the strongest man needs to be reminded that his voice still matters." That line hit Steve harder than any applause ever had. It wasn't just about what he'd done. It was about who he had become, and how that identity echoed far beyond any audience he could see. That was the moment the show transformed. No longer a segment, no longer content. It became communion, one soul recognizing another, across oceans, across struggles, across dreams. Steve didn't move. He sat there quietly, hands folded in his lap, eyes filled with tears. For the first time in a long time, Steve Harvey, the storyteller, the comedian, the host, had no story, no joke, no transition, just presence. And sometimes, that's enough. As the screen faded to black, and the studio lights dimmed ever so slightly, a new kind of silence settled over the room, not the silence of awkwardness, but of reverence. Steve Harvey sat still, his fingers interlocked, his eyes glassy and distant. You could tell something deep had shifted inside him. But just as the audience tried to process what they had witnessed, the screen behind Steve flickered again. This time, it wasn't a pre-recorded video. A soft digital chime rang out, and suddenly, live footage appeared, a video call connecting from Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso. The moment the live feed stabilized, President Ibrahim Traoré appeared once more, now in real time. He wasn't seated behind the formal desk anymore. Instead, he was in a modest room, dressed casually, standing calmly with a warm smile. "Mr. Harvey," he said, "for once, let me speak to you man to man, not from a title to a title, from one dreamer to another." Steve leaned slightly forward, visibly emotional but attentive. "You see me now as a president," Traoré continued. "But I was once a boy who walked barefoot to school, carrying books tied together with string. Many nights, I slept on an empty stomach." The entire studio held its breath again. Steve lowered his gaze, visibly moved. But what came next cut even deeper. "Years ago," the president said, "in a crowded internet cafe, I saw one of your videos, 'Don't Give Up.' I didn't understand every word, but I understood your tears. I saw your passion, your pain, your belief that no one is too far gone to be lifted." Steve's hand slowly went to his mouth. You could see it in his eyes, disbelief, awe, humility all at once. "That video gave me something I didn't know I had," Traoré said softly. "Hope. The belief that I, too, could rise. That I could serve, not just survive." Then came the line that changed everything. "That boy, became me. The studio gasped. Steve's jaw dropped slightly, and he blinked back the weight of those words. His voice cracked as he tried to respond, but the president kept going. "Last week," Traoré said, "I heard your talk about living with purpose, and I realized it was time I said something back." Then, with grace and sincerity, he made an offer that no one, especially Steve, could have anticipated. "I want to invite you to Burkina Faso. Not as a celebrity, not for the cameras, but as a brother. Come see what your words have built, not in headlines but in hearts." Steve's eyes filled again. His voice was gone. He simply nodded, then lowered his head. But the president wasn't done. "There's an orphanage in Ouagadougou," he said. "The children there know your name. They watch your clips. They laugh at your jokes. But most of all, they believe they matter because you mattered." A hush fell over the room. The crowd, many already tearing up, listened as Traoré gently added, "In 7 days, those children will gather in the village square, waiting to meet the man who gave them hope across an ocean. If you come, you'll be giving them something no politician ever could, the gift of being seen." Steve stood up slowly. He was trembling. The applause didn't come right away, not because the moment didn't deserve it, but because everyone knew it would have interrupted something sacred. Finally, Steve managed a whisper, "I'll come." The audience, filled with people from all walks of life, stood with him, not for the spectacle, but for the humanity. The next morning, without alerting the press or informing the networks, Steve began preparing for a journey that would change his life. No entourage, no stylists. Just a carry-on bag, a translator, and a quiet, growing resolve in his chest. He boarded a private plane under the radar, avoiding headlines. He wasn't going for ratings. He was going for a letter one written by a child whose name he didn't yet know, a child who believed in him more than he had ever believed in himself. As the plane soared above the Atlantic, Steve sat by the window with a small printed transcript of the president's words in hand. He had highlighted one line in red ink. "Even the strongest man needs to be reminded that his voice still matters." He read it again and again. Tears came again, but this time not of surprise, of clarity. Of a man realizing that legacy isn't about how loud you are, but how far your whisper travels. Backstage, the atmosphere remained heavy with emotion. Steve Harvey sat in his dressing room, no longer the polished entertainer ready for the next laugh, but a man reflecting deeply, holding a printed copy of the president's message in both hands. His team stood quietly nearby, unsure whether to speak or simply let him process it all. There were no cameras, no jokes, no schedules, just silence, and something sacred hanging in the air. Steve stared down at one specific sentence, underlined in red. "Even the strongest man needs to be reminded that his voice still matters." That line kept echoing in his mind, louder than any applause he had ever received. He had inspired millions, yes, but today someone had spoken directly to his soul. A soft knock broke the quiet. One of the producers stepped in, a bit hesitant. "Steve, the translation just came in the full message. You may want to read the last part," she said, handing him a folded piece of paper. Steve unfolded it slowly. The final paragraph was more personal than anything he had expected. It read, "When I was a boy hiding under the wooden table of my grandmother's market stall, I would hear her laugh while listening to your voice through a crackling radio. She didn't understand your language, but she understood your spirit. That voice helped raise me." Steve put a hand over his mouth, emotions rushing in. He thought of his own grandmother in Cleveland, who had always believed in him, even when he didn't believe in himself. How many times had he wanted to quit? How many times had he thought no one was listening? And yet, somewhere across the globe, a child hiding under a table had found strength in the sound of his voice. "Oh my God," he whispered. He stood up abruptly. "I need to go," he said to no one in particular. The producer, surprised, asked, "Go where?" "To Burkina Faso," Steve replied. He said, "They're waiting for me. I can't not go." Within the hour, he was on the phone arranging a private flight. No press. No entourage. He didn't even want the network to announce it. This wasn't a show. This was personal. A few days later, the plane descended toward Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso. Through the window, Steve could see dusty streets, children playing, and people going about their lives. There was no red carpet, no media mob. Just a simple sign held by a young man at the airport, "Welcome, Brother Steve." Steve stepped out into the heat, his heart pounding with both nerves and anticipation. He was taken directly to the orphanage the president had mentioned. As the van turned the final corner, Steve saw something that made him choke up. Over 100 children had gathered, holding handmade signs that read, "You matter, we love you," and "Thank you, Mr. Steve." Their smiles were wide, their eyes glowing. And then, from among them, stepped a little girl holding a small worn notebook. Her name was Aka. She walked slowly toward Steve, notebook clutched tightly to her chest. When she reached him, she held it out with trembling hands. "This is for you," she whispered. Steve knelt down, took the notebook, and opened it. Inside was a letter written in careful English. It read, "Dear Mr. Steve, my name is Acha. My papa died 2 years ago. My mama is sick. Sometimes I cry at night. But one day someone played your video. You said you were born to do something great. I believed you. Thank you for speaking to us even if you didn't know we were listening." Steve couldn't hold back. He cried, openly and freely, surrounded by children who saw him not as a celebrity, but as hope made real. The orphanage director approached, tears in his own eyes. "These kids pray with your words," he said. "They've memorized your stories. They don't just admire you, they follow your heart." Steve looked around the murals on the walls, the laughter of the children, the echoes of belief in every corner. He realized something profound. His words had built more than an audience. They had built family. That night, Steve stayed with the children not in a hotel, but in a simple guest room at the orphanage. He read bedtime stories, helped serve dinner, and sat outside under the stars answering their questions about life, faith, and dreams. And when the youngest ones asked him, "Why did you really come?" he smiled and said, "Because someone reminded me that my voice still matters, and I needed to come tell you, so does yours." The sun had just begun to rise over Ouagadougou, casting a warm, golden light across the orphanage yard. Steve Harvey stood by the window of the guest room where he had slept, looking out at the quiet morning scene, kids slowly waking up, caregivers preparing breakfast, the sounds of birds cutting through the stillness. It felt far from the world he was used to. No flashing lights, no tight production schedules, no media buzz. Just peace and clarity. As he stepped outside, a young aide greeted him with a gentle smile. "Mr. Harvey," he said, "the president would like to see you." Steve nodded, still absorbing everything that had happened. He was driven through the early morning streets, quiet, sunlit, alive with simplicity. People waved as the car passed, children pointed, but there were no crowds, no chaos. The vehicle stopped outside a small market area, worn wood stalls, weathered tarps, the scent of mangoes and spices filling the air. Waiting for him at the end of a narrow lane was President Ibrahim Traoré, but this time he wasn't in a suit. He wore a plain white shirt and traditional cloth around his waist, simple and symbolic. "Steve," he said warmly, reaching out for an embrace. "Welcome." It wasn't a handshake between leaders, it was a hug between brothers. "I wanted to bring you here first," the president said, walking beside Steve through the market. "This was my grandmother's stall." He pointed to a partially collapsed wooden structure with faded paint. "This is where I used to count coins for her as a child. Right here, under this table, I first heard your voice." Steve looked down, eyes locking onto the worn earth. "I didn't understand your words, but I felt them. So did she. She would laugh every time you laughed, and in her laugh I found strength." Steve was speechless. The two men stood in silence for a moment, the memory breathing between them. Then Traoré bent down, picked up a small stone from the ground, and placed it in Steve's palm. "This is where hope began," he said. They continued on, driving to a rural village about an hour outside the capital. There, under the shade of a large tree, a small gathering of women waited. One elderly woman stepped forward, slow but steady. "This is Traoré said. She used to sit next to my grandmother every week during market days. She remembers you." Steve looked puzzled. "But how? She doesn't speak English." Traoré smiled. "She didn't need to. She felt your joy. Alwa used to say, 'That man, he speaks from the chest, not just the mouth.'" Alwa stepped forward and gently placed her hand on Steve's cheek. She whispered something softly in Moray. A translator spoke. She said, "If my sister had met you, she would have fed you. She would have called you her son." Tears welled in Steve's eyes again. He didn't try to stop them. He knelt slowly in front of AWA and took both her hands in his. "I think I was meant to meet her through you," he whispered. The visit continued to a nearby school where children had prepared a song. No stage, no microphones, just small voices and a single drum beat. As Steve entered, the children began singing in Moray. The melody was hauntingly familiar. Steve froze, his lips parted slightly. "I know this song," he said under his breath. The president nodded. "It's the tune my grandmother used to hum while cooking. You once hummed the same melody during a show years ago. Somehow, the connection found its way." Steve stood still, surrounded by sound, memory, and mystery. For a moment, time seemed to fold. His grandmother in Cleveland. The president's grandmother in West Africa. Both humming the same melody, unknowingly passing love, strength, and healing across generations and continents. One little girl handed him a wooden carving, 2 hands holding a heart. Steve clutched it to his chest and wept. It was no longer about a trip. It was about closure, healing, and coming home in a way that few people ever get to experience. It was 2 boys, one from the dusty corners of Africa, one from the broken blocks of America, finally understanding that their lives had always been connected, not by blood, but by spirit. The next morning, Steve Harvey found himself standing at the gates of something he never thought he'd see in person, a schoolyard in Burkina Faso filled with laughter, music, and more than 100 children waving handmade signs. Some signs bore simple words like, "Hope and you matter." Others had drawings of Steve's smiling face next to phrases such as, "Thank you for believing in us." But one stood out, a sign with just a heart and a pair of open hands. Drawn in crayon. That image would stay with Steve for the rest of his life. President Traoré was there too. No formal security, no scripted press. Just a tall soldier-turned-leader standing under the West African sun, smiling at the moment. He turned to Steve and said, "You planted seeds without knowing. Today, you see the forest." Steve nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. He wasn't there as a celebrity anymore. He was something else, a symbol of resilience, connection, and unseen impact. As the children gathered in a large circle under a mango tree, one of the teachers stepped forward holding a small notebook. It was Aka's again. "She wanted to give you this before you leave," the teacher said. Inside was a new letter, written the night before. "Dear Mr. Steve," it began. "Today you played with us, laughed with us, and made us feel seen. When I grow up, I want to help people the way you do, not with money, but with heart." Steve closed the notebook gently, hands shaking. The weight of that simple wish humbled him more than any award ever had. Later that afternoon, President Traoré invited Steve to a quiet patch of land just outside the city, a tranquil spot lined with sunflowers, with a single baobab tree standing proud in the center. "This land," the president said, handing Steve a rolled-up document tied with a red ribbon, "now belongs to you. Not as a gift to honor your fame, but as a place to rest whenever the world feels too heavy. A place of peace. Your place." Steve stood still, heart pounding. "Mr. President, I didn't come for this," he said. Traoré nodded. "I know. That's why it's yours." And then something completely unexpected happened. The president knelt one knee in the dust, his hand placed gently over Steve's chest. "I don't kneel for power," he said softly. "But I kneel for hearts that give light." Without a word, Steve followed, kneeling too, both men silent as tears rolled freely. They weren't political figures or public icons at that moment. They were sons of women who once prayed over radio signals and laughter, now meeting in their shared humanity. Later that evening, back in the city, Steve joined the children again for one final gathering. This time, they sang the same lullaby, the one their grandmother had hummed, the one Steve somehow already knew. But now, something had changed. It wasn't just a song. It was a bridge. And as the last note faded into the warm evening air, Steve whispered, "This is what healing sounds like." Steve Harvey didn't sleep much the night before his departure. He sat on the edge of the simple bed in the orphanage, staring at the wooden carving Acha had given him, two hands holding a heart. He turned it over slowly, as if trying to absorb the meaning carved into it. Around him, the orphanage had gone quiet, the children tucked into their dreams, their laughter still echoing faintly in the air. Steve wasn't thinking about cameras or headlines. He was thinking about what it meant to be seen, truly seen, not as a star, but as a person, as a brother, as a son. Before sunrise, he walked through the empty courtyard, barefoot, letting the cool earth press against his soles. The mango tree swayed gently in the wind, and above it, stars faded into dawn. For the first time in a long time, he felt still. Not successful, not celebrated, just still. And in that stillness there was healing. At the airport, there were no reporters waiting, just President Traoré, standing alone beside a black SUV. He wore the same white shirt and traditional wrap, hands clasped, eyes calm. When Steve approached, the president embraced him once again, but this time the hug lingered. "Thank you for coming," Traoré said. Steve replied, "Thank you for calling me." Before boarding the plane, the president handed him a sealed envelope. "Don't open it now," he said. "Open it mid-air. When you're between here and there, that's when you'll understand it best." Steve nodded and boarded quietly, holding the envelope like something sacred. As the plane soared above the clouds, Steve finally unsealed the letter. It was handwritten in graceful script, not formal, but personal. The letter began, "Dear brother Steve, when you leave this land, do not think you are going back to your world. Think of it as carrying our world with you. You now know the sound of our laughter, the weight of our pain, and the strength of our dreams. This is not goodbye. This is a beginning." Tears welled up again. He looked out the window, clouds like soft hills rolling beneath him. The letter continued, "You helped raise a boy who became a president. But more than that, you reminded a nation that hope can come from anywhere, even from the voice of a stranger." Steve clutched the letter to his chest. As the plane descended into the U.S., no one was waiting with cameras, no welcome banners, no interviews. Just Steve, stepping off with a quiet heart, holding a carving, a letter, and a truth too deep for sound bites. The next morning on his show, he didn't open with a joke. Instead, he placed the carving on his desk, looked straight into the camera, and said, "This is the most important thing anyone's ever given me." And then he did something rare. He played the children's song. Not translated, not subtitled, just the voices of kids from across the ocean, singing from the heart. The studio fell silent. Viewers cried. And around the world, something shifted. Because for once, it wasn't about entertainment, it was about echo and healing. In the weeks that followed Steve Harvey's return to the U.S., something had changed not just in him, but in how people saw him. Yes, he was still the comedian, still the host, still the voice that brought laughter to living rooms. But now, behind that familiar smile, was a deeper sense of presence, a quiet knowing, a heart that had been both broken and healed on the same journey. The episode featuring the children's song, the one he aired without subtitles, without explanation, became one of the most shared moments of his career. People from across the globe wrote in, commenting things like, "I didn't understand the words, but I felt every note," and "This healed something I didn't even know was hurting." It was no longer just about Steve Harvey. It was about the space he had created, a bridge between worlds, languages, and hearts. Backstage, during a commercial break one afternoon, Steve sat quietly reviewing emails from fans. Among them was a message from a mother in Brazil. "My son has cancer. He watched your show. He heard that song. He cried. And then he smiled. Thank you." Another message from a retired soldier in Poland read, "I never cried in uniform, but I cried when I heard those children sing. Thank you for making me feel again." Steve closed his laptop slowly, wiped his eyes, and whispered to himself, "God, this is bigger than me." And it was. That evening, he called his producer and said, "Get me a line to Burkina Faso. I need to speak to President Traoré, not tomorrow, not next week. Tonight." 2 hours later, the secure video call connected. There he was, the man who had changed everything. Calm, humble, eyes as steady as ever. Steve leaned into the camera, voice low but full of emotion. "Mr. President, I thought I was just a comedian from Cleveland, but now I know I was part of something greater." Traoré nodded gently. "And I," he replied, "was just a soldier who once walked barefoot. But we do not become who we are alone. Sometimes it takes the voice of a stranger to remind us of our duty, our purpose, our light." Steve smiled. "You reminded me that this isn't just a platform, it's a pulpit, and I want to use it well." Traoré paused, then said something unexpected. "I've spoken to my council, and we'd like to honor you publicly, not for what you've done, but for what you've healed." Steve shook his head slowly. "I didn't heal anyone, sir. I just listened." "And that," Traoré replied, "is the most powerful kind of healing there is." That night, Steve stayed up journaling the first entry he'd written in years. He didn't write about success, or money, or ratings. He wrote about a mango tree, a market stall, a girl with a notebook, a song with no words but infinite meaning. Weeks turned into months, but the feeling didn't fade. Steve Harvey carried Burkina Faso with him wherever he went, not in a literal sense, but in his posture, his purpose, and his presence. Every show felt a little different now. He spoke slower, he listened more, he smiled deeper. Audiences noticed. They couldn't always explain it, but they felt it. Steve wasn't just performing. He was connecting. He was carrying something sacred. Behind the scenes, he began working quietly on a new project, not a television show, not a product, but a foundation, one that would send resources, teachers, and support to communities like Acha's. He didn't announce it on air. He didn't post about it on Instagram. He just did it, because some things are too real to advertise. One morning, as he reviewed blueprints for a new school wing being built in Ouagadougou, a package arrived at his office. It was wrapped in plain brown paper, no return address. Inside was a small framed photo, Steve kneeling before the baobab tree, eyes closed, hand on heart. Beside him, President Traoré. No caption, no note, just the moment, frozen in time. Steve stared at the photo for a long time. Then he stood, walked to his office wall, and hung it up next to his awards, and Emmy plaques not above them, not below them, but right in the middle. "This," he whispered, "is the only one that matters." That same week, during a live show taping, a child from the audience stood up during the Q&A and asked, "Mr. Steve, what's the bravest thing you've ever done?" The room went quiet. Steve smiled gently, then said, "Going somewhere I wasn't sure I belonged, and finding out I did." He paused, then looked into the camera and added, "Sometimes the most powerful places your voice will ever reach are places your feet have never touched." The clip went viral overnight, not because it was dramatic, but because it was true. A month later, Steve returned to Burkina Faso quietly, again without press. This time, he wasn't there to visit, he was there to open something. The school expansion was finished. And at the front of the new building, carved into stone, were the words, "Built not with hands but with words that healed." Steve didn't speak long at the ceremony. He didn't need to. He simply looked at the children, then at the carving, then said, "This was never about me. It was always about you." It was early evening in Cleveland, Ohio. The sky had turned a soft orange, casting long shadows across Steve Harvey's backyard. He sat alone on his porch, a steaming cup of tea in his hand, and the wooden carving from Aka placed gently beside him. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't thinking about what came next. He wasn't planning, producing, or performing. He was remembering. Memories of dusty roads, warm embraces, children's voices, and the deep, unshakable feeling of being called not by fame, but by something higher, something ancestral, something divine. He thought of President Traoré's words. Sometimes we meet not because we are famous or powerful, but because our grandmothers prayed for us at the same time, under the same sky. Steve exhaled slowly. He looked up. The stars were just starting to peek through the dusk. Somewhere, he imagined, Acha was probably doing the same, holding her notebook, perhaps humming that song. That song that had somehow crossed oceans and generations. He reached for his phone, opened a voice recorder app, and began to speak. "This isn't for a show. This isn't for YouTube. This is just for me. For whoever needs it someday." His voice was calm. "I've done a lot of things in this life. I've made money. I've made people laugh. I've been on stages bigger than I ever dreamed of. But the moment that truly changed me came from a letter written in broken English by a little girl I never met." He paused, then continued. "We talk a lot about success, but not enough about significance. And significance doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it sings in a language you don't understand, but your soul knows it." A tear slid down his cheek. "I'm not here to be remembered for jokes. I'm here to be remembered for how I made people feel, especially the ones who never got to say thank you." He ended the recording, set the phone down, and picked up the carving. His fingers traced the two hands holding a heart. A symbol of giving, of holding, of carrying someone else's hope when they can't carry it alone. Then, with a quiet prayer, he whispered, "I'm still listening." Because stories like his, and Aka's, and Traoré's never really end. They just keep echoing. They say stories are just words until someone feels them. But what you've just witnessed wasn't just a story. It was a reminder that no act of kindness, no genuine word, no true connection ever goes unnoticed. That sometimes, the words you speak today could be the reason someone survives tomorrow. That a child in a village you've never seen might be carrying your hope in their heart because you were brave enough to share it. Steve Harvey didn't set out to change a life across the ocean. He was just being real. But that realness, that honesty, that humanity built bridges stronger than any fame ever could. And you? You have that power too. Your voice, your story, your truth. It matters more than you think. So speak, share, listen. Don't ever underestimate the reach of a sincere heart. Because somewhere, someone is waiting for a voice that sounds just like yours. If this story moved you even just a little, drop a comment below. Which part touched your heart the most? Tell us where in the world you're watching from. And if you believe that real stories change lives, hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel for more content that connects us, not just entertains us. Comment just one word, healed, to carry the feeling forward. Let's keep this echo going. One story, one voice, one heart at a time.